Yeah, thank you all. We also have a second set of questions. One question. So we're interested also in thinking about the methods that Richard and Frank introduced to the field and the contribution that was. And we've, in fact, you all touched on this already a little bit. We have in mind here his work in early kalām, Mutazilism, Ash'arism, and his work also in Al-Ghazālī, and indeed this debate with Michael Marmura. So very briefly, so what new avenues did he create in Islamic studies? Medieval philosophy, Islamic philosophy and theology. How did he expand our understanding of Islamic kalām? And also on that point, what debates did this cause? And have these debates, in your all's opinions, been resolved? And in what ways do you see the field advance as a result of these things?
I may take a slightly different tack from my fellow speakers, because I work mainly in falsafa. I am not a specialist in kalām, but I am also the oldest. And I can tell you that the work of Dick Frank made an enormous difference in both the study of falsafa and the study of kalām. Because before that, I think people in reading Ibn Rushd and Farabi, mainly Farabi, were thinking, if they were in falsafa, that kalām was intellectually bankrupt. So they were neglecting that. I had done some more serious kalām, so I could see a bit very quickly that Dick Frank was showing how all the intellectuals at the times were really communicating. They may have had sometimes different views, different terminology, but they were dealing with the same issues. So that it was quite a revolution in the field. And if you were in falsafa, or you were vaguely introduced to kalām, but it was more reading creeds than anything else. And I think that, at least in falsafa, that gave me another slightly different approach, that certainly even philosophers like Farabi, and I work mainly on Farabi, were very disdainful, at least in the way they wrote, of kalām. They were, in fact, taking into account quite a lot what kalām was saying. So that made me a bit more suspicious of all these very strange way of speaking about kalām, and not to take too seriously. I thought there was a lot of rhetoric a bit in that. So it was really a change in the approach, that suddenly people who were in falsafa thought that they should pay much more attention to kalām and not consider them as two different things and one very inferior to the other. And I think that's something that is not always fully made its impact in the study of falsafa. But I think that made me think a lot, to look a bit differently at Farabi, and to have much more respect and awareness that the intellectuals were communicating much more than we thought. It was not that the Muslim thinkers were on one, the Jewish ones there, the Christians were there. There was a lot of intercommunication. And I think we sometimes still miss the point of some of the things that are issues because we don't know the context, and that it was a real context for any intellectual in the Islamic Empire. And I think that is something that still need to make its impact, at least in falsafa. I think some people have not yet realized that there is more to kalām. I don't know if it is your opinion.
I agree. I have a little bit more to say than that, but yeah.
And by the way, Frank, if I can say, I have known some of the people who worked as students with Dick. I met Dick, I had already my PhD, I was already teaching, so I didn't have that kind of contact. But I can tell you that Sidney Griffith told me that he was the only person who had the courage to write a PhD with Dick. And Sidney told me that he thought a long time that Dick Frank didn't think much of his work. And he was surprised when somebody who had had conversation with Dick Frank told him, you know, Dick Frank said this and that and good things about it. And I can tell you, I don't think she makes a secret of that, that Janet Timby, who is a famous teacher of Coptic and who had Richard Frank as a teacher, said that she was absolutely frightened by Dick as a teacher. So I am blessing my stars that I was no longer a teacher when I met Dick Frank. I was a young professor. So I didn't have that kind of let's say, but Dick was very demanding, but in a good way, because he was also very demanding of himself. And when I was reading his publication, before publication, so to speak, if I would point to something which I thought it wasn't clear, or I thought it's a function of what I knew of falsafa, that maybe that should be nuanced or whatever, he would always take it seriously and look at it. Because sometimes the very harsh people are the people who can stand any, it's not the attitude of Dick Frank.
Yeah, I want to agree that what I think Dick Frank did do for the field is just all of a sudden take kalām, take it very seriously, and treat it philosophically. And so I should say again, my training is in a philosophy department. I'm in a philosophy department now. So in 1991, I started graduate work. I was going to work on the Latins. I just found myself happily, reading the Latins. They were all reading the Arabs, and I'm like, oh, well, I should find out what the Arabs are, are doing. And it was like, oh, there's no translations. And there just wasn't a lot of work, no work being done by philosophers on this, or I don't think any work. It was being done in other departments. And I was encouraged to learn Arabic, and why don't you just learn Arabic really quick, and you can write your dissertation on that. Okay, I'm still learning Arabic, but at that time, the only way I could get any knowledge of kalām, there was Wolfson's wonderful sort of text, but then I wanted to go back to primary texts. What you had to do, in my case, was what was available in translation. The only thing that was available in translation really was Moses Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, and that discussion. And so, I had read that, and so I was like, okay, yeah, who needs kalām? It's been refuted. And then I do meet Dick Frank on this first occasion, and we went out for dinner with he and Sydney, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh man, I need to learn some kalām. And so I decided that when I was going to go to the AOS the following year, I was going to, brush up on kalām. I picked up Being and its Attributes, thinking this should be an easy read. I'll read through it. And so I gave myself like a week before, and I'm like, what was I working through this? Now, in my defense, I found out later that the general thought that went into a lot of that book was that Richard was talking with Puffin,
Tom Puffer,
Heideggerian, a Heideggerian anatomist, and they had been drinking a bottle of bourbon. And he was telling me this over dinner. It's like, yeah, we were reading Asher. I was trying to put him into these Thomistic terms, and I had this Heideggerian, and all of a sudden it made sense to me. And I'm like, okay, that might explain why I couldn't read this text. It's a Heideggerian who's boozed up. But exactly, the thing is, I've now gone back, and it was one that I lived with. And I think what came out of that was, Maimonides had sort of trivialized this really, really rich tradition, and that he tried to throw everything together to make this sort of here's what kalām is, and yet there was all these subtleties that were going on. And so it became very, difficult for me, because I always knew when I was reading Avicenna, when I'd come across these discussions, I would sort of want to find them in the Greek tradition, but I realized there's no reason to think that that's the only tradition, and I have this woeful sort of lacking in my own knowledge. And so I would always try to, can I find, the kalām? And this was, very much, again, I think, Dick Frank saying, this, and he did not. I remember once being challenged because I was just translating Mutakallamun as theologians. We do this, and it's like, yeah, but they're more than just theologians. They're engaging this philosophically, and I can't remember if it was he who sort of suggested at least speculative. If you're going to say theologians, but speculative. Make sure that you realize that their worldview is a philosophical worldview, and it now you kind of, if I had it all to do over again, yeah, I'd still do Avicenna, but I would be reading it against these texts, because I remember, the Mughni had just been discovered not too long prior to this, and he was like, you should be reading this. And I went to the library dutifully, with my 3 years of Arabic, and there's this 8 volumes. I'm like, yeah, that's not happening. But I've now gone back and I started looking at all these texts that Frank said, you need to know these, you need to be reading these. And it's just, he opened up my world. And I also should say about Being and Attributes. So when I picked it out of the library at Penn, somebody in big pen had put, these are Mutazilites, they are not Muslims. So, and I'm like, showed that because I told Frank that he goes, no, they were. So anyway, is it over to Toby, I guess?
Yeah, Toby, yeah.
The question. Well, again, I'm going to personalize this. I totally second what John said, in that he brought to an Anglophone public's attention the value of studying kalām. But I think in terms of his methodological focus, the attention to definitions, and then getting on to Ghazālī and post-Ghazālī, the awareness of equivocation and thereafter synthesis. But in terms of my own research, it is that opening the door through Ghazālī to a post-Ghazālian intellectual world, where there is a trend, a will to some kind of synthesis, taking on board Ibn Sina. And I've done quite a lot of work over more recent years on Shahrastani, who is completely from that post-Ghazali milieu. In fact, his position at the Nizamiya at Baghdad was opened up for him by As'ad al-Mayhani, who is a kind of Ghazalian. So what you find in Shahrastani mutatis mutandis, because his higher thought appears to have an Ismaili inflection, but he was very engaged with Ibn Sina. He has an extensive report on Ibn Sina's philosophy in the Milal, and then he writes a refutation of aspects of Ibn Sina's theology, the Musara. And you find Shahrastani involved in similar conundrums to Shahrastani. What did I just say? To Ghazali. So Shahrastani is also very concerned to marry a theology in which God has absolute sovereignty with an intensely hierarchical cosmos, akin to the Avicennan one, but more Ismaili in its flavor. So anyway, I think Richard Frank in Al-Ghazālī and the Asharite school opened the door to this whole post-history of Kalam's interaction with Avicennism for me.
Yes, one important methodological aspect has already been mentioned by many, namely the fact that Richard M. Frank took these texts extremely seriously. I mean, he read them like, you know, in other contexts, one would only read Aristotle or Plato, and that was the right way to read them. That's one thing, and that's very much acknowledged. But I want to point out something that was very important for me, and that I think was at least similar important. That was the fact that Richard and Frank read these texts within their original context. And I should say, I myself, in particular in the past years, have become a harsh critic of the Western engagement with Islamic philosophy since the beginning of the first academic work, which is in the early part of the 19th century, where Westerners started to read these books. And the great example is, of course, you look at the last page of Tahafut al-Falasifah, the famous fatwa with the 3 points where Al-Ghazālī declares the philosophers unbelievers and apostates, and saying, look, this is clear, we can make some sense out of this. This is, of course, made, you know, was the death sentence for the history of philosophy in Islam. And that, of course, was perpetuated also. And what was lacking is to read this particular document within its original context. And people jump to conclusions. And this is just one example about the many, I should say, mistakes that previous researchers have done in our field. And Richard M. Frank's particular, I would say, you know, reading of Al-Ghazālī was a great example, again, in this case, of you would read it one way if you just pick up the text. But then if somebody actually reads it who has a thorough background in Avicenna, as Richard M. Frank had, and also had a thorough background in Asharite kalām, he would actually listen. He would say, you don't, that's not what's going on. There's something else going on in this text. So he would really come up with very original results by putting it into a context, into its original context where it actually belonged, and would know the thinkers before, particularly the thinkers before, not so much the thinkers afterwards, but the thinkers before. And that really showed that you cannot just say, I opened this book and I try to understand that. You have to do work on the context in order to avoid the kind of mistakes that our field has done previously. And I would really say that the last 20 years of maybe the last 10 years of the 20th century, only that was the moment when maybe the last 20, because Joseph van Es also was significantly part of that, and he started to work, you know, in the 1970s. So let's say the last quarter of the 20th century was the moment when when there was a wholeheartedly revolution in Islamic studies, moving away from assumptions that were valid before.
Yeah, I mean, most of what I would have said has already been said. So, but what I can just sort of add is when I did my undergraduate studies in the 2000s, I think you could really see the impact of taking kalām serious, because when I started to learn about kalām and read my first text, I had no doubt that this is sort of a really sophisticated system of thought. And it was only retrospectively when I knew more about the history of the field of modern studies about kalām that I learned about this earlier bias against kalām, saying, okay, this is so sort of simply minded thinking, whereas the real philosophers are to be found among the philosophers. So this is something I think that really had changed when I did my undergraduate studies. Yeah, so, and I think, I mean, he was certainly not the only one you've mentioned, like Joseph van Es or Dumaret and Madelung. So, I mean, this generation, I think, has done a lot for the field, and fortunately, this has changed. And I think, I mean, I think we see that now that much more students are also, or PhD theses are written in the field of kalām. Maybe just one aspect sort of about this taking kalām serious is also that, well, I first sort of was fascinated by Mu'tazili theology, and of course, Richard Frank wrote a lot about Mu'tazili theology, and perhaps it was more easily accepted that Mu'tazilism is sort of more philosophically, but then when it came to the early Asharite school, I think there was the same bias against early Ashari school, because this was again that, okay, we had sort of the flourishing of philosophical kalām, early kalām with the Mu'tazilis, but then came the Asharis and sort of reduce it to a simple creed. But again, I mean, when you look at Richard Frank's contribution about the classical kalām, as he calls it, classical Ashari kalām, like the papers he wrote on the ahkam in Ashari theology, also I think it's 70 pages long article in ASP on Ashari ontology, which could, I think, even be a small book. I mean, it's clear that this is not a simple system, that this is really complex. And so that he also contributed to sort of appreciate also early Ashari kalām as something that should be taken seriously.